Welcome back, everyone, to part 3. So now I'm going to spend some time talking about actually making plant collections or herbarium collections. And so there's a few things to keep in mind. This is a challenging thing to try to demonstrate over Zoom. It's always nice when you can get in there and be handling the plant. But just a few important considerations is when you are collecting, you want, if at all possible, to go for fertile material. So if you'll want to try to collect plants that are either fruiting or flowering, and that'll make it a lot easier for identification. So an exception to that is a lot of woody plants, especially some places in the tropics. There are plants that flower very infrequently and are very distinctive vegetatively. So for woody plants, that's not as strict a rule. But for annuals especially, you'll definitely want to get fruit or flowers. It's also really important to try to get a representative specimen, or if you don't, you may need to note otherwise. So for example, if you're looking out across this population of sunflowers, and some of them are 5 feet tall or 6 feet tall, and you say, oh, well, this one is perfect. It's got a cute little flower, and it's just the right size to fit into my press. So Ed Voss who's a botanist at Michigan, would always make a note on his specimens. He said he went for a smaller plant to fit into the press. There's also tends to be a major bias in herbarium collections to go after weird looking plants. So things that are unusual. So if you're attracted to those things and want to collect those things, it's nice to say on the label, this plant is different from these other plants around it. Another really important thing is including the underground parts. So this can be summarized by saying no top snatches. So this is a tendency when people are collecting for the first time, and when you grab a plant or you say, I'm going to get a piece of this, is you might take the tip of a branch, or with ferns, people would get the top part of the frond and not get the whole plant. And then you see it on an herbarium specimen. Somebody mounts an herbarium specimen, and it's just this tiny little piece. So it's important to think about the potential longevity of an herbarium specimen, all the costs associated with storage, with curation, with mounting, all the materials that go into that. You want to try to make the best specimen you can possibly make. And there are different estimates. I think in California, it's in the neighborhood of $20 per specimen to accession. I've seen estimates as high as $50 for just the labor involved with taking that specimen with its label and newspaper and translating it into an accessioned mounted digitized specimen. Because there's a lot of people involved with that process. So making the best quality specimens you can is always a good goal. So that often means including the underground parts. So really trying to get some root or some rhizome. I work with a lot of big ferns, or there can be plants that are just enormous and not really suitable to fit onto an herbarium specimen sheet. And so in cases like that, everything that you can't capture in the field and get onto a specimen, you want to try to get into the notes. So to say, oh, the rhizome was 10 centimeters thick, and maybe you can make a really nice thin slice and dry that flat. Maybe you can't. The other thing to think about is, an herbarium specimen is going to be stacked onto other herbarium specimens. So making that sheet as flat as possible is really important. And that's easier said than done. With some species, or some specimens do not lend themselves well to becoming flat. So sometimes that just means taking your Felcos and cutting through a rhizome, making a cross section. It'll dry better. You'll be able to see it a little bit more easily. So whatever you can do to kind of try to make that thing as flat as possible. And you want to be able to include both the upper and the lower side of the leaf. So if you have a branch, before you press it, you want to take a leaf and flip leaves over so that some are facing up and some are facing down. And this is the sort of thing where it's just really great to get out there and try it. Until you do it yourself and until you take your plants out of the press and look at them, that's the fastest way to learn, you know, how you can improve or what you might be doing wrong. When people are up to this for the first time, there's a tendency to include too much material. Ideally, you don't want anything overlapping. So sometimes, depending on the specimen, that's just not really possible. That's just the way the plant grows, and it has some three-dimensional aspect to it, and that's just going to happen no matter what. But if you can avoid that, if you don't overlap anything in the newspaper that you doesn't need to be overlapping. So you may find that you use more than one sheet of newspaper to make a single specimen that will be mounted together. And that's just so you can dry things effectively. So that leaf is going to dry best when it is in contact with the newspaper and is not in contact with another leaf. So you'll make the best specimens. And so sometimes less is more. So you can trim off pieces. If there's a lot of leaves, say a plant has whorled leaves or something, you could remove some of those. I would leave the petioles behind to indicate that that was from a whorl. And then you kind of want to think about it in terms of what is this going to look like as a thumbnail on a computer screen of specimens. If you have all these leaves on top of each other, it's just going to be kind of a big black blob in the middle of the sheet without a lot of definition. So you want to say, well, what if I took this away? Would it really communicate what this plant actually looks like? So you want to think about your herbarium specimen as a way to communicate what does this plant actually look like. And so oftentimes less is more. Another thing is, as a rule of thumb, I think this is a nice description in Mike Simpson's Plant Systematics book, is for every 20 individuals, collect no more than one individual, or, you know, it's just one flowering shrub. If there are 20 flowering branches, collect one. So that's a good rule of thumb, is you don't want to come in and deplete an entire population. So this is something to be thoughtful about, especially if you're collecting something that might be rare. And in some cases you might say, well, I guess I could just take a photo of this and maybe I'll just make an iNaturalist observation for now and not collect it, because there's only 2 or 3 plants here and I don't want to wipe them out. So that's another place where just having the option to, well, I'll just take an iNaturalist observation today and I won't collect this species. Sometimes that is, that could be the right call. And then lastly, I'll just mention that if you're collecting on private property, you generally want to have the permission of the landowner. And if you're collecting on state parks or national parks, etc., you want to have a permit to doing the collecting process. And I'll just say California state parks have recently really streamlined their permitting process. So you can send in a single permit application and get permission for multiple state parks at once. So that process has actually gotten a lot easier recently. And generally people are helpful, and most agencies want to support research. They also want to learn about what you've done. So being able to share data and share information about the specimens you collected and what you may have learned, especially if it can help inform management. And I think this is especially important with international travel or international collecting, is you don't want to be just going to a place and extracting all these resources, taking them home and learning all about them and publishing them in scientific journals that are behind a paywall. You want to be able to communicate what you're learning with your host country or your host institution. So making an effort to just be in communication about those sort of things and getting permission beforehand and sharing your findings afterwards is always a good call. So I can't tell you how many people I've gone into the field with who like to carry around a black plastic garbage bag full of plants when they're collecting. And I just want to say, I think there is a better way. So there are 2 main things that I am doing when I'm in the field collecting plants. So I may be collecting specifically for herbarium specimens, making vouchers, or if I'm teaching especially, or doing drawings or illustrations, I want to get fresh material and I want to get it back to the lab in the best condition it could possibly be in. And so don't use the black plastic garbage bag that everything gets beat up in. It gets hot in the sun and it's a big mess and jumble of debris, gets ripped open on sticks. Not my preferred material. This is called a vasculum. And so this is kind of the state of the art for the last couple hundred years. And it's basically a metal box about the size of a mailbox. And usually they have a stylish strap. You can see this guy modeling one. And so the way you use this is to just take newspaper, get it wet, not sopping wet, but fully hydrated. And then you line the interior of the box and make sure to keep it hydrated. And that evapotranspiration that happens through the day keeps the inside of that box humid and cool through evapotranspiration. So you can just start packing plants into it. And actually, the more you have in there, the more humid it stays and the less beat up the plants become. So you can really pack one of these things just totally full of plants, and then you get them home and put them under stems under running water, give them a fresh cut, put them into glass, and you can just have this amazing, beautiful collection of plants for further study. If you're going to key them, if you want to draw them, if you want to show them, this is definitely my preferred tool for fresh collecting. So you can see this one is just kind of packed full of plants, and you get back to the lab and you just kind of pull them out one at a time very carefully. And once you get them back in water, they just keep their shape, keep growing. So if you can get your hands on one of these, they are wonderful. They're hard to find. And there's a tendency to see them as like this archaic, antique, curiosity, but this is actually the most practical tool you can have as a field botanist if you're trying to work with fresh material. So keep your eye out if you see one at a garage sale or anything like that. This is my preferred method for collecting for herbarium specimens. So this is based on a model designed by Tony Resnicek at the University of Michigan Herbarium, and he's got an Etsy shop. They're only about $350. Just kidding. This is something you can make yourself with 4 pieces of cardboard and maybe 1 or 2 rolls of duct tape and a nylon rope. And the racing stripes are optional, but basically one piece of cardboard that'll be, a ventilator herbarium press sized piece of cardboard in the middle, 1 for each cut in half for the top and the bottom, and then 1 full piece of cardboard for each side. So it becomes, with use, it becomes kind of flexible. And I would just put lots of newspaper in this. Each time I collect a plant, in 1 piece of cardboard, I lift up the cardboard, put that plant on the bottom. And so there's only 1 piece of cardboard in there, and that just keeps the collected plants separate from the untouched newspaper. I keep my clippers or digging tools right inside there, Sharpies right inside, and just kind of carry it under your arm and go into the field. And all of your specimens are in order when you pack them up, so you don't have the garbage, dump out the garbage bag and try to reconstruct your numbers in terms of which things were collected at which time. I just go through and I start numbering the newspapers, and then everything is in order when you unpack it. And then the other thing that's pretty nice about this is that it takes some of the fight out of the plants. So sometimes when you're trying to press a plant, it's just very resistant to becoming flat. It's kind of stiff, and the leaves want to go in all different directions. And so you do your best with the first pass. You try to get it in the newspaper, arrange it the way you want it, and then you leave it in this press for a couple hours, walk around. And by the time you open it up, that plant is a little bit more compliant. It is behaving a little bit better, and then you have a second pass opportunity to try to arrange the leaves, make sure you have upper and lower leaves, that the inflorescence is kind of showing. And so that's kind of a nice thing, is just having a two-step process. So from this field press, things go into a standard press, which I'll get to in a moment. So the other thing that's kind of nice about it is that it keeps plants from drying out. So if they start drying out too quickly, they'll start wrinkling and they won't press flat, or they might start going brown. And you know, if it's raining, they actually won't get wet. So it does tend to maintain everything at like a nice stable humidity. And you know, say you fill this thing up and you know, you've got to catch a flight or something, you can just put it in the refrigerator and get to it, you know, in a couple days, and things will stay pretty nice in there even if you can't get them into a press immediately. So this is sort of my preferred method of collecting, is into a field press. And so here is a standard herbarium press. So it's fun to fill them up, and you have somebody stand on top of them and really tighten the straps. So again, this is just alternating cardboard and newspaper. So the dimensions of a press, and I think the cardboard that you use, or the cardboard that I would use to make a field press, would be 12 inches by 18 inches. So that is kind of the standard size. And then a specimen, there's sort of a universal size of an herbarium specimen, and that is 11.5 inches by 16.5 inches. So these are dimensions that you'll want to keep in mind. People usually press them a little bit bigger, and then you know, have some room to cut them down to size when you're going to actually mount. So I was looking online, and herbarium presses are kind of stupid expensive. They're like $100 if you are to buy one online, but they're not difficult to make. You can kind of see how they're put together, and as long as you make them to these specifications, about 12 inches by 18 inches, that's great. I made my own once, and I used like really giant pieces of wood, and I now appreciate, like, oh, I could have used kind of thinner, smaller, lighter weight pieces of wood, but I have like one really big chunky press. But you know, the basic idea, you know, if you just have cardboards or, you know, anything, you know, the wooden slats are nice because it just helps with ventilation, but really you've got some flexibility in how you do this. And maybe you have a Encyclopedia Britannica you can set on top. There's a lot of ways around spending $100 on a press, if that's not what you're up for. And so, you know, I have recently invested in some ventilators, which, you know, are cardboards, and it can seem silly to spend money on something as basic as a piece of cardboard. But it does take time cutting these things out of boxes, and they do wear out, so they do get crushed. If you think about what this thing is designed to do, these corrugates kind of run along the long side of the cardboard. So if you're cutting them out of boxes, like, you know, whatever cardboard you have lying around, try to orient the corrugations so they're along the long edge, because that's where you want airflow kind of going through. And so when that plant is in that newspaper is pressed against this cardboard, it's going to draw some moisture out of the newspaper, out of the plant, and then airflow through the cardboard is what's going to help dry that out. So heat alone is not ideal. It's really not the heat that you want so much as just the movement of air. And you know, heating the air tends to make the air drier, which makes the plants dry faster. But you could dry plants in cold air, as long as the air is really moving through them. You can tie them securely to the hood of your car. There's a lot of ways. If you're working in the desert, it's different than working in the tropics. So blotter paper is still used by a lot of folks. I'm just totally unconvinced of the utility of blotter paper. I tend not to use it. The one place where it would be really useful or valuable is if you're in a really humid environment and you have a lot of blotter paper and you're able to continuously change it. So again, that paper is just absorbent. It'll pull moisture out of the plant. But then once it does that, you really need to just open up your press again, remove the blotter paper that's wet, lay it out to dry, and replace it with dry blotter paper. So you have to do that over and over again to really take full advantage of that paper. Otherwise, I don't really think it's an improvement over just using pure cardboard. And I would love to hear other people's experience with this. The tradition of pressing plants relied on blotter paper before corrugated cardboard was really became popularized, which was, within the last 100 years or something. So, is this just a tradition that people have clung to because they have all these blotter papers and that's how plants are pressed? I don't know. I don't think they're that useful unless you don't have airflow and you really need to use the paper itself to dry plants. So I'll be curious in the question and discussion to hear other people's feelings on blotter paper. Newspaper. So if you happen to find a newspaper stand where the newspaper really approaches that 12 by 18 dimensions that you want, it's a good thing to subscribe to that newspaper or to try to pick it up when you see it, because nothing is so nice as having perfectly sized newspaper for pressing plants. If it's too big, you can trim the edge, which I recommend doing beforehand. If it's too small, you can double it up, but that's just not, it makes a big difference. It's really nice to just have all the newspaper that is the correct size. And Dr. Strother, who's the curator of composites in the UC Herbarium, he goes straight for buying the newsprint, unprinted newsprint, just so he doesn't get distracted. So once you start, especially if you're mounting specimens and it's, maybe you have a stack of things from Indonesia in the 1930s, you can find some really interesting newspapers and it can really slow you down. So it is helpful to have the blank newsprint. You can also order it that's perfectly sized. So if you have funding for that, it can be worthwhile. And then these are my favorite tools. So I really like the Felcos for especially collecting woody plants, just being able to make a clean cut. It's also a good idea just in terms of phytosanitary principles. You want to wipe the blades down with ethanol, be thoughtful about the potential of spreading pathogens around, especially if you're, doing a lot of traveling from different places. Same thing with this is called a hori-hori. It's like a Japanese gardening knife or digging knife. You want to keep it clean, maybe rub it down with ethanol, try not to bring dirt to new places. And this is just an awesome tool because it does have a serrated edge. So you can use it as a saw if you need to. And it's just really great for being able to dig up plants and get like a really nice root attached. So oftentimes if I'm collecting ferns, I might use the hori-hori to collect the fern and dig it up. And then when I get back to the lab and I'm pressing, I'll use the Felcos and then, cut through the rhizome or do a longitudinal section of the rhizome to dry it or make duplicates out of a single plant. So it's nice too for just being able to clean up your specimen and trim it after the fact. So those are my two favorite collecting tools. And then we mentioned a little bit in the last question and discussion session about collecting on silica. So depending on what your intended purpose is for your vouchers, if you think you or someone may like to do a molecular phylogenetic study or have tissue with DNA preserved the best possible way, I like these little silica desiccant packets and put them in a tiny zipping plastic bag with a label. I would put a label in there with the collection number, all the taxon, the date, my name, all of that would just go into a bag. And then you can either have a separate collection or you could include it with the fragment packet on the herbarium specimen, but this is really critical if you're hoping to sequence DNA, or you would just like to know that somebody who might like to sequence DNA in the future would have the best possible material. But having a really high quality, quickly and efficiently dried herbarium specimen can also yield excellent DNA. And then this I'm going to get to in the next section, but some people like to bring a field notebook and take notes in the field on paper and pen. I've actually sort of transitioned to all online, where I actually use my phone and iNaturalist as a field notebook and record my data directly into the app. So the next section, I'm going to get into how I do that and just my preferred method and what kind of data I like to collect. So we will get into that, but having something to record your name, your number, all the associated data that goes along with that specimen you'll want to have with you. And then lastly, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Most herbaria that you donate specimens to, they have their own method of the paper that they use and the standards that they have for mounting. But if you're making your own collections or you are donating mounted specimens, there's a nice website that Florida Museum has that details some of the methods and materials that you want to do that. But the most important thing is to just use archival material. So there are paper specifically designed for mounting herbarium specimens. This is linen tape that has glue in it that this is like a stamp moistener. This is a great tool for wetting the linen and using these bent forceps to make the straps on the specimen, and then using this archival PVA glue. So just using archival materials, and so there's a lot of information about that online, and I won't go too in depth there, but I'm happy to take any questions about collecting or mounting. Thank you.